What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into 5 brews that I'll be playing this weekend here in Magic the Gathering Arena. As Dominaria has released, and we've gone into a rotation of sorts with the meta and everything. Here are a few brews that I kind of came up with that I just want to experiment with, just because, you know, we got a little bit of newness. Sure, there are some decks that are kind of established and older that, you know, are still, probably going to be in the meta. But with all these new cards and kind of a different kind of pool of libraries, these are some decks I'm kind of experimenting with, utilizing some of the newness from Dominaria United while also kind of using some of the cards from the other sets. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. So the first deck up on the list is going to be a Sultai self-mill style deck. The goal of the deck is essentially to mill ourselves, get creatures in the graveyard, use various abilities to get said creatures out of the graveyard throughout the game, while also, not trying to mill ourselves out in that process. We do play a wide range of cards. Most of them are from the older sets, though we do splash in some of the newness to kind of help us fix our mana, as well as, kind of to take benefit of what we have in our graveyard. It's definitely an interesting deck overall. It's a deck that I still think it could be tweaked here and there, but I do think this is definitely a good starting point for some sort of self-mill deck. What we're trying to do here in the 1-drop slot is Willowgeist. It's the 1-mana 1/1 trampler that whenever one or more cards leave our graveyard, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, we gain life equal to its power. This is probably the only 1-drop that I want to play in the deck. I did at one point experiment with the uncommon mushroom as well. The one problem is that card eats cards from our graveyard or afterwards, and I didn't really want to eat things from our graveyard to give it additional +1/+1 counters when it flips. So I just kept the Willowgeist just for the most part because of that reason. I think Willowgeist is good just because we do have various ways to make cards leave the battlefield and give it +1/+1. And I didn't want to lose cards from our graveyard by eating them. Another card up in that 1-drop slot is going to be Dig Up. This is a good card, I think, in the early game to maybe fix our mana sources. We are playing 3 colors. Some of the colors we are playing aren't the most friendly when it comes to mana fixing. We are playing a lot of tap lands or slow lands as well. I was thinking about playing like the pain lands in the deck for the colors that we could. I wasn't sure. I feel like this deck is more of a mid-range deck than more of an aggro deck. And I didn't really want to have to take early points of damage, especially against aggressive matchups where that late points could matter in the late game. So I went with ahead and played more tap lanes. So I do think something like a Dig Up is good here just to help us fix our mana and kind of be able to cast our spells, of the various costs. Then in the 2-drop slot, we have Infernal Grasp as a spot removal spell. 3 copies of it, kind of hopefully remove things out from the early game. I did also experiments with Cut Out, I should say. It's one of those things that you could also add that into the deck as well in the 1-drop slot if you want to. Though the one thing I did find when I was playtesting with this deck is that I kind of always had green mana in the early game, sometimes the black mana because it's one of the splash colors, I would say. I didn't have that as often, so I do feel like that's why I went with Infernal Grasp compared to something like, a Cut Out or something like that. Then we follow that up with an Undead Butler, 1/2 that mills ourselves 3 cards. When it dies, we get to return target creature card from graveyard to our hand. Definitely a good card overall. Helps us fill our graveyard early, which is definitely very good. And then, worst case scenario, we chump block with it. We can get a card back, which then triggers a Willowgeist trigger. Definitely a good card overall. We also have Shigeki, Jukai Visionary in the deck, just a one-off in the deck. We could experiment with probably like 2 of. The one thing I did find, yet again, with everything is that whenever we returned like creatures from our graveyard to our hand, it made some of our other creatures in our deck weaker overall, and that's kind of not the goal of what we're trying to do. We're kind of self-milling ourselves to get our creatures really, really big as quickly as possible. And in worst case scenario, depending on the situation, we could Shigeki and get key spells back from the graveyard to our hand when we need them in case we like mill over a removal spell or something like that. This is kind of where Shigeki kind of falls in as being that way to kind of dig out those spells from the graveyard to the battlefield. But still, overall, a good card. Worst case scenario, you play him as his 2-drop 1/3 self, and you can tap him for 2, mill ourselves, reveal top 4 cards of the library, put a land card in the battlefield, tap him, put the rest in the graveyard. So, he does play well with our self-mill strategy as well as he's a good, decent ramper. The new card from Dominaria United that helps, I think, this deck kind of work in the Sultai colors is the Urbog Lagroif. It's a 2-mana star plus 1+ star. Essentially, it's a card that comes out as a battlefield based on the amount of creatures in our graveyard, and its power and toughness are equal to that. Its toughness is 1 greater. And then on top of that, it has an ability that you can kick it for blue, you can kick it for black. If you kick it for both, each time you kick it, you essentially mill yourself 3 times. are 3 cards each. And then, yet again, another great card. You know, you can play this as a 2-drop if you have, maybe you got lucky, you got a couple cards in the graveyard, or worst case scenario, you play this as a 4-drop, and there's a good possibility that it comes out as like a 4/5 or 5/6, depending on where your mill situation is overall in the game. This is definitely a pretty cool card, definitely a card that I kind of saw get released, and this is kind of a card I wanted to play in this deck. Then we have Tainted Indulgence. That's another good card to kind of dig ourselves up, you know, giving ourselves a way to kind of mill ourselves in a sort, because we draw 2 cards and discard a card unless there are 5 more mana values in our graveyard. And like I said, you know, you discard a creature card that you may not need, and then you kind of pump up your creatures that get that benefit. And then, you know, in the late game, if we do have our 5 different mana colors, which I don't think this deck plays that many different mana types, you can just draw 2 cards. But I like it just for the idea that we can fill our graveyard up with the discard. We also have Meathook Massacre in the deck. You know, yet again, another good removal spell, just kind of a way to remove a very wide board pretty decently for not too much mana. I did also experiment with Drag to the Bottom, though the one thing I saw there is that the downside to that was, even though we are playing 3 colors, we are playing, you know, a mixture of basic land types in our deck. There was a lot of points where I didn't want to you know, -4/-4 our board, just because some of our creatures are on a little bit of the weaker side, and that's kind of why I went away from playing that one and decided to go with Meathook Massacre, where I can more so control how much I want to -4. Then we also include a couple copies of the Old Stick Fingers. Yet again, another good spell where you can tap X in a green and a black, and essentially you mill yourself. You reveal X creature cards from the top of your library. You put all those creature cards revealed this way into the graveyard and put the rest on the bottom of the library in any random order. And he's one of those creatures that gain benefit based on how many creatures are in our graveyard, so definitely good there. We have Witness the Future, you know, as kind of like that fail-safe thing where it's a card that allows us to kind of put cards back into our library depending on what the game state is. We do self-mill ourselves a lot, so there's a lot of points where you could get really low in cards in your library. And this is kind of one of those cards that help us maybe prevent that from happening. You play one, and then essentially this allows us to kind of pretty much infinitely have enough cards in our graveyard or in our library that we never mill ourselves out completely. So overall, pretty good card there. We had a couple copies of Hero's Downfall, just another way to, just in case there's any pesky planeswalkers on the battlefield, this is a good way to deal with them. On top of that, it's a pretty decent removal spell. We have 2 copies of Old Rutstein, just another way to kind of self-mill ourselves. He mills when he comes out in the battlefield, and every upkeep he also mills, and depending on what he mills, we either get a treasure if it's a land, we get a blood if it's a spell, and we get an insect if we mill a creature. So, you know, definitely very good there. Definitely, you know, helps us provide us a little bit of ramp, a little bit of card draw, as well as a little bit of, you know, protection with the little blockers he makes with the pest tokens. And then the last card up is going to be Slogurk, the Overslime. You know, besides us milling ourselves for creatures, we are also milling ourselves with lands, and Slogurk's good in the sense that every time land enters the battlefield from anywhere, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on the Overslime, and then we can remove them, we can bounce it through our hand. But in general, whenever he leaves the battlefield, not when he just dies, but whenever he leaves the battlefield, we get to return up to 3 land cards to the graveyard, to our hand, which is definitely good, which also kind of pairs decently well with Willow Geist, so definitely kind of that cool kind of top-end card. And this deck is overall very low on the curve. You know, we aren't playing, you know, a ton of expensive spells. Some of the spells we can pay additional because they have X cost or they have the kicker. But for the most part, our top end is really 3/4 for the most part, outside of Meathook Massacre, which could be much higher. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We are playing 25 lands just because, you know, it's one of those things. I do think we want to make sure we hit a mixture of lands as well as creatures. We are playing 1 copy of Otawara. Essentially, this is like our only island that is just a monocolored island. We have 1 swamp. We have 2 copies of Takenuma, 2 copies of Baseyu, 1 forest, 2 copies of Contained Aquifer, just another way to kind of filter lands. On top of that, Shipwreck Marsh. We have Deathcap Glida, 3 copies, 2 copies of Haunted Mire, 2 copies of Dreamroot Cascade, 2 copies of the Tangled Islet, and then 4 copies of the Plaza of Heroes. A very unique card that I think fits okay with the deck. You know, we have a decent amount of legendary creatures. At the same time, we also have a decent amount of non-legendary creatures. So it is one of those things that if we have a Slogurk, we have an Old Rutstein or an Old Stickfingers down the battlefield, we'll be able to produce the mana colors of that type based on the legendaries we control. Also counts Meathook Massacre as well, which is definitely pretty sweet. But overall, pretty decent card. Maybe there's something we cut down on just because, you know, we're always not going to have 2 of those legendaries out on the battlefield at a given time. But still, nonetheless, this is definitely a very interesting deck. Definitely a deck, like I said, you are milling yourself, so it is kind of one of those things you have to kind of be mindful of how many cards you have in your library and what the game state is, as you don't want to kind of play around for too long or you're going to mill yourself out completely. But still, nonetheless, a definitely interesting build that I'll probably still tweak and make adjustments as I kind of see based on how the meta develops. So the next deck up on the list is going to be a domain mid-range style deck. The goal here is to get the 5 different land types, get the benefits of the domain ability, but we are playing it more in like a way to be more of an aggressive deck than more of like a control deck overall. But we are taking advantage of that domain ability. It's actually fairly easy to get domain out pretty early in the game, just because you just need 2 triomes out with a certain color assortment. So you really just need, like, let's say, for example, a Spar headquarters. Then we just need to finish that up with a Xander's Lounge, and then we already hit 5 colors for the deck, which definitely makes it pretty easy to hit domain. And on top of that, we are also playing the dual lands, the common dual lands that also are land types as well, to help us kind of make sure we get there. But nonetheless, this deck is pretty straightforward on what it's trying to do. It's us trying to use that domain ability, get some, decently sized creatures out early to kind of protect us, and then kind of overwhelm our opponent in the later game. We do have 2 copies of Cutdown in the deck, as I do think you want to make sure the early game, as you kind of are setting up your domain colors, you have ways to remove things out of your way, and having a 1-mana removal spell that hits a lot of the early game creatures is definitely very good. 2 copies of Infernal Grasp to destroy target creature. In the process of losing 2 life, you get to get another good removal. We are playing Radha's Firebrand as a way to be a little bit aggressive. It's a 2-mana 3/1. Whenever it attacks, we can make target creature that has power less than Radha not be able to block. And then our ability has domain, and based on how many land types we have out when we attack in with her, we can pay 6 mana all the way down to essentially 1 mana, just the red, and give her +2/+2 to end a turn. And it costs 1 less for each basic land types among lands we control. And we are playing domain, so our goal is to hit all 5 land types. So like I said, the goal here is to get her to have that ability to only pay 1, which is definitely very good there. We have Nishaba Prowler, another 2-mana star 3, has trample, and then its power and toughness equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control. So, on turn 2, depending on how lucky we get with our draws, we can definitely get this even to a 4/3 power on turn 2, which I find to be really, really good. There isn't really a good way to get it to a 5 power on turn 2, but, still having a 4 power at best is going to be like a very good thing. Your opponent's going to be like, holy crap, I have to go through a 4/3 now, or figure out a way to kill that 4/3, which makes this card definitely very good in a domain style deck when you're trying to be more aggressive than control-y. We do have Llanowar Green Widow, not a card that gains benefit in the sense of its card face, as it is a 4/3 spider for 3 mana, has reach and trample, but the secondary ability here has domain that we can return from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It gains if this permanent leaves the battlefield instead of putting it anywhere. It gets exiled, so it's like one of those things that reoccurs, and it costs less for the domain ability based on how many basic land types. So, in the early game, you play it on turn 3, maybe chump block with it, maybe attack aggressively with it, and depending on how many basic land types we have, we can later return it back to the battlefield at like the end of our opponent's turn, or just maybe before something happens to it, like it gets trespassed or something like that. Then we have Witherseed Treaty. This is kind of like our unique card in the deck that it doesn't really gain us any sort of, super duper good benefit in the way, but it's a saga that has 3 triggers. We can read ahead, so we can skip to whatever one we need. The chapter 1's pretty good, especially in the early game if we're trying to fix our mana to make sure we hit domain, as I do play outside of the island. I do play a basic of the other colors. We can also in chapter 2 create a Saproling creature, which is not probably the most ideal chapter. You're not probably going to start on chapter 2. You're either going to go to 1 or 3. And then chapter 3 is we give target creature we control +X and trample to end a turn, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. And this is kind of one of those things that this card's kind of like our finisher in a way. Like, if we do have a pretty decent attack, maybe our opponent doesn't really have any good blockers, we just give one of our creatures +5/+5 and just swing in really, really big. And if they have like a little like 1/1 or a small creature, we're just going to trample over that creature and kind of, almost hopefully finish the game at that point. Then we go into the 4-drop slot. We have Urtai the Resurrected. It's a 4-mana 3/2 of flash. When it enters the battlefield, we get to choose up to 1. We either counter target spell, activate ability, or triggered ability, and its controller draws a card. That's the one downside to it, but still not a bad card. And the other chapter is we can destroy target creature or planeswalker. Its controller draws a card. So we give our opponent a card back for us destroying it, but we do get a creature / a way to kind of remove it. And it's just kind of one of those cards that, is kind of like a decent value, as you get some sort of disruption spell baked into a creature, and it being a 3/2 flash is definitely pretty good there. Then in the top end of the deck, this is kind of where we get into the more interesting cards, the very, very, I would say, kind of powerful cards overall. We have Sphinx of the Clear Skies, a 5-mana 5/5 flying ward. that whenever it deals damage to a player, reveal top X cards of our library, where X is the number of basic land types you control. This is where we want to make our opponent make like very tough choices. They have to separate those cards based on how many domain we have. Hopefully 5 by the time this is out, into 2 piles. We get to choose one. The other one then goes into the graveyard. And piles can be empty, which is interesting. I guess they had to add that just because they wanted to make sure, just in case you only have domain of 1, that this still gets some sort of effect. So this is definitely a good card. Making your opponents have to make those tough decisions are very, very good, and we have a lot of cards that have a lot of value, so they're gonna have to make those really, really tough decisions when it comes to spending what cards go into which pile and which ones go into your hand. You get to choose which then goes into your hand. Also in the 5-drop slot, we have 2 copies of Slimefoot Survey. It's a little bit of an expensive ramp spell, but has domain. We get to search our library for up to 2 land cards that have basic land types, which is kind of like another way to fix our mana if there's a weird situation where we didn't draw like a triome or a dual land of a certain card type. This is like going to be our way to hopefully fix that situation, which is definitely not bad. And we get 2 of them. They both go on the battlefield tapped, which is also pretty good. So it immediately triggers that domain ability and locks us out at that 5 different colors. Top of that, then we get to look at top X cards of our library. X is the number of land types among lands we control. Put one of them onto the top of your library, the rest on the bottom of the library, any order. So it's kind of like, okay, let's look at top 5, put one of those on top, maybe a card that we definitely want to play next turn, and then the rest go on the bottom in our library in any random order, which is definitely pretty good. Not all the time you're going to always hit a hit, but always setting up your card draw is always very good. And with mill not really being hopefully a really, really big thing, unless your opponent makes you shuffle your library, that card could be really good and take advantage, and they can follow up on the following turn. We are playing 2 copies of Territorial Marrow, just a 5-drop star. Its power and toughness are equal to twice the number of basic land types among lands you control. Yet again, another card that by turn 5, hopefully have our domain ability, in lock, that we have all 5 colors out. And yet again, this is a card that's going to help us, be very powerful. They're going to have to remove it, or this is just a very, very big creature that if we do play this and then follow up on the turn after and play like a Wretched Treaty, this thing could be a 15/15 trampler that is going to be really, really hard to absorb all that damage. So definitely a pretty interesting card. Just a 2 of though, because it's not like anything like spectacular. It's a pretty vanilla card outside of the domain ability, but it's a card that you definitely want to probably play at least a couple copies of in a deck that focuses on domain. Another card that I think we'll see a ton of play, not just in domain style decks, but decks that just play multiple colors, as long as they have those basic land types, is Leyline Abindon. This is a great enchantment that kind of, spot removal something. So it's kind of like a spot removal spell as well. And the spell costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. And then when it enters the battlefield, we exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. This thing can go all the way down to 1, depending on how easy you can get your domain online. Definitely a very strong enchantment. This is going to be that card that everyone's going to get frustrated, because I'm going to throw it out there. A lot of decks are going to play, even if they play just only 3 colors. They're probably going to make sure they play basic land types, and they'll probably play this card if they are playing white in those 3 colors. Definitely a very, very good card. Then we have Herd Migration. Yet again, another card I wasn't very sold on when I saw the preview for it, but now that I kind of see it now, it's actually a pretty good card overall. By the time we played on turn 7, we get to create possibly up to 5 3/3 beast creature tokens, which if our opponent doesn't have any sort of way to board wipe the board, those 3/3s will definitely, deal 15 damage to them, or at least, they'll have to chump block a lot of those beast tokens in order to do so. Early game, if we need to, yet again, fix our land types, we can always discard it, search our library for a basic land card, put that card into our hand, then shuffle, and we gain 3 life. So this is kind of like Domain's environmental science card. And when you're playing like 4 or 5 colors, this is definitely a card you want to make sure you add, because it's going to be a way to help us fix our mana, make sure we have the land colors we need in order to proceed with what we're trying to do. So overall, I mean, that's the main deck type. I would say, yet again, it is a mid-range deck. We are trying to get to that mid-range point. As you can see, a lot of our good cards are kind of in that 3 to 5 window, and then there's a couple cards that are on the top end that kind of hopefully help us finish off our opponent. And the one thing that I am still in the process of working on, as it's one of those things that we're all still trying to figure out what the best way to do lands for multiple color decks, especially without the pathways, is kind of making sure we have the right balance of dual lands, single color lands, and whatnot. This is kind of what I'm going with. We have 2 plains, we have 1 island, 1 swamp, 1 mountain, 1 forest, 2 swamps, 4 forests. We have 2 tangled islets. We have 2 haunted mires, 3 Xander lounges, 3 Jetmir's gardens, and 4 Spara headquarters. And Spara headquarters is the main one, as I do think you want to make sure we hit the blue, we hit the green, we hit the white, as there's a lot of it's a weird, interesting balance. Like green's the main color, blue's kind of like the second color. Black and like red are kind of like the last one. That's why the Xander Lounge is here. That helps us kind of make sure we hit those colors in the dual lands. And then Jetmir's Garden is just another way to balance out the green, the white, and the red as well. And then hopefully we have enough lands in this. I was thinking about playing legendary lands in here, but yet again, I do want to make sure, because I do think what's going to happen as a lot of people play a lot of decks with various land types, I want to make sure I have basics in the deck. So just in case someone decides to try to basics check me, I have at least a basic land replacement that I could get from my library and put it on the battlefield. That's why I have a decent amount of extra basics in the deck. But yet again, something you could look at land-wise if you want to experiment with that. Though there is that thing, like I said, it happened in last standard, and if people are trying to play more aggressive multicolor decks, it's probably something that will happen in this current standard. So we saw, the domain mid-range deck, or slash aggro deck, I would say, and now we have our 5-color control deck. So, there's two spectrums I think of how domain is going to work in this standard. It's definitely, something that we're still very early on, but it's definitely, a deck type that is overall very, very good. So this deck is definitely interesting in the sense that this one, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, control that early game and really try to get to our top end spells to kind of take over the game and kind of, take out that fight in our opponent to the point that they just want to scoop. It is a 5-color control deck, as we are splashing cards of, various colors. Really, the only reason why we're playing 5 colors is to, hit the Kami War, as I do think this is a very strong card in like a control deck, as we are trying to keep the board pretty empty early and then kind of take advantage of that. In the early turns, we have cut down to kind of get rid of those early, spot removal creatures. A lot of the aggro decks will play small creatures that may grow, but we want to make sure we hit them early, and 1 mana instant speed removal is definitely good there. We have a couple of courier briefcases as a way to get like a treasure, as well as, we get a 1/1 token out of it, and then in the late game, if it's still out and hasn't been like destroyed or we used it for a treasure, we can always sacrifice it and draw 3 cards, which is definitely very good. Another reason why we want to play 5 colors. We have Temporary Lockdown as a kind of like our early game board wipe, as this exiles each non-land card with permanent value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. And outside of our briefcase, we're not really losing anything, as you see that my curve really doesn't start until turn 3. So, if I'm looking to probably wipe the board, I'll probably, wait until our opponent, puts out a decent amount of stuff, and this will kind of eat all that stuff. And then, depending on most of those aggro decks, a lot of them don't really play a card that can take care of an enchantment like this, so definitely good there. We are playing Zur Eternal Schemer. It's a 3-mana 1/4 flying and gives all our enchantments Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof, which is definitely very good. So then, if we have this Temporary Lockdown out, we can then essentially protect it with Zur, as that now they can't target that enchantment until they remove Zur, which is definitely good. And then on top of that, we can tap 2 mana, a white and a colorless, and we give target non or enchantment we control becomes a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and toughness equal to its mana value. So now we essentially turn that enchantment that's been on the battlefield into a creature that can attack our opponent, gain some life, and also, be a decent chump blocker, as it does have Death Touch as well. And it still has Hexproof, so they can't target it with a spell to remove it. In the 4-drop slot, we also have Archangel of Wrath. Another card I'm a big fan of. This is definitely a card that I do think, like in a control deck that maybe plays white, this is definitely a good card to have, as it does have a pretty decent kicker. Its kicker ability is that whenever it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, it deals 2 damage to any target. If it was kicked twice, it deals 2 damage to any target again. And because it has flying and lifelink, every time it deals that 2 point of damage, we're going to gain 2 life in the process, as long as this is out on the battlefield, which is overall very, very good. And, for 6 mana, doing 4 damage in some sort of way is, I think, overall pretty good. And on top of that, you still get a creature out of it, which makes it very good there. We have Drag to the Bottom in the deck just as a, experimenting with it. I figured, we can play this, or we can play Meathook Massacre. Because we are playing enchantments, turning Meathook Massacre into 2/2 is definitely not a bad idea. But because, I wanted to see how good this card is in like a more focused control deck, this card can be a pretty cheap version of a Meathook Massacre, in the way that if we can get it to our domain pretty early, this pretty much can be -6, -6 overall across the board, depending on what the board state is, if we hit our domain colors, which I find to be really, really good there. We also play Atari Resurrected in this deck. Yet again, another good spell to kind of be a little bit of counter spell, as well as removal spell, which overall is pretty good, even though we do give our opponent that additional card draw. I do also add a couple copies of Slimefoot's Survey, as, just another way to make sure we have the cards we need to on the battlefield to get our domain triggers. And on top of that, put in the 1 card on top of our library is definitely very good there, especially, we want to dig through our library, make sure we get ramp up into whatever land color, how much land we need. And then on top of that, maybe find the answer on the following turn that we can play against our opponent. Overall, I think, 2 of is definitely not bad there. because we are playing, you know, a domain style deck, we are going to play Leyline of Binding. It's a strong card. You know, it's early spot removal if we can get our colors out early. You know, its flash speed makes it that much better, and you know, this is just kind of like another way to kind of spot removal something that maybe just pesky or in our way, as it can target any non-land permanent, which makes it that much better. A couple copies of Farewell, just because, you know, we want to make sure, you know, we can get creatures off the battlefield if we need to. We can exile all graveyards if we need to. If our opponent's playing any sort of artifacts, we can exile those. And on top of that, if they are also playing enchantments and maybe, you know, we are kind of behind and they're like we're matched up almost like a mirror, this is going to be our one card, and maybe get rid of what they have on the battlefield to get what we need back. So definitely good there. We have 4 copies of Kami here, just to exile target non-land permanent opponent controls, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Then each opponent discards a card, which, you know, we can target something we have if we want to set something up on our second Saga chapter and still make them discard a card. And on top of that, we get to return it back on the 3rd chapter. We flip it over to a 6/6, and it's all colors, has flying, has trample. Then whenever it attacks, we get to choose a non-land permanent card in our graveyard, return to our hand, and then it gets X+X+0 at the end of turn, where X is the mana value of that card. You know, we play a fairly, you know, I would say 3 and up land, so this could get +3/+0 all the way up to 6, depending on what the board state is. And then just like everything else, we also have Herd Migration in the deck as just another way to get a lot of board presence really quickly. This is just a really strong card for domain style deck, in that sense that this is like our top end card, as it kind of makes us go wide really quick, and our opponent has to figure out how to deal with it. The one thing I would say that's also pretty interesting with the deck is that you could Zur your Kami War and then make it a 6/6 immediately before you even get to that 3rd chapter, which makes it pretty good there. Zur and your Leyline's really good. But overall, you know, this is definitely an interesting deck. Yet again, just like the last one, pretty interesting to kind of play around. And this one is 5 colors, so we do also play a pretty decent swath of, you know, various lands to kind of hopefully get us to that 5 colors. So we do play, you know, our round of basics. That's the one thing I would say that we want to make sure we hit. We have 3 plains, we have 1 island, we have 6 swamps, we have 1 mountain, 1 forest, we have 2 sacred peaks, we have 3 Rafine's towers, we have 3 Zatora's proving grounds, and we have 4 copies of Spara's headquarters. You know, like the last deck, you know, the land base is still, you know, being tweaked. I didn't want to play too many tap lanes, as there's a lot of stuff we want to play early. And that's why I do have a decent amount of basics here as well. I did mess up with the swamps. I meant to replace the swamps with the fancier swamps, so that's why there's like 6 swamps. That feels kind of awkward. But for the most part, you know, it's definitely still a very interesting deck. I do think, you know, this will go through tweaks depending on how the meta develops. Maybe we throw some more enchantments in here. We could always look at possibly throwing in that 4-mana enchantment, the Hallowed Haunting, just because we are playing a fair amount of enchantments in the deck, and, you know, being able to play enchantments, get creatures out of it, and then turn like enchantments we control into creatures, I think will definitely be pretty good there. But still, nonetheless, yet again, another decent, I think, you know, look at a possibility of what a 5-color control deck could look like in, you know, Dominaria United Standard. So the next deck up on the list is Mardu Angels, and Angels did lose quite a bit, but I do think there's still something to Angels that could be pretty good overall in the meta. You know, there's a lot of good cards, a lot of good top-end Angels, I would say. You know, the one thing that Angels did lose was a lot of those early game Angels that made Angels what it was. But if once you get kind of to that 4 to 5/6 drop slot of Angels, there are a lot of good Angels that bring a lot of value to, you know, the board. You know, what we're trying to do in the early game is just kind of control the board state. We have 3 copies of Cut Down to get rid of those early aggressive creatures that your opponent may have. We have 3 copies of Vernal Grasp, yet again, to spot removal creatures. We do play Meat Hook Massacre just in case. I do think, you know, a deck like this still needs a way to wipe the board up, you know, clean up the board, maybe of a bunch of small creatures. Or if we're behind, you know, a good way to clean up the board and just kind of give a, you know, make the, you know, kind of catch us back up to where our opponent is. We do play, you know, 4 copies of Giada as a good way to kind of ramp up into our Angels. Still, it's an Angel that is a 2/2 with Vigilance, so we can still attack in with it and leave it back as a blocker if we need to. But the benefit here is every Angel that comes out after her comes out with an additional +1/+1 counter for each other Angel we have on the battlefield. So definitely, you know, overall pretty good. Definitely something that you want to look for in your opening hand that you want to hit early, and then kind of hopefully play into more Angels as the game goes on. We have Inspirant Overseer, just as another early turn Angel, with it being a 3-mana 2/1 Angel with flying, and then when it enters the battlefield, we gain a life and draw a card. We are playing Fable of the Mirror Breaker, 3 copies of it, just to kind of, you know, get a creature out that when we attack him with it, we get to create a treasure token. We can discard 2 cards and draw that many cards. So, you know, digging a little bit deeper, maybe to find an Angel, depending on what the board state is. And then the 3rd chapter, we get the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, where we can tap 1, tap it, and make a copy of another non-legendary creature we control, except this creature has haste. So that's definitely very good there. You know, we do have a couple angels that we could take benefit of that kind of trigger. Since we are playing a mixture of black, white, and red, we are playing Angel Fire Ignition, just another way to kind of push damage through on our opponent. We give target creature +2/+2. Give it Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Hasten to end a turn, and then we can flash it back for 4. Overall, very, very good card in this deck. We are playing Archangel of Wrath because it fits into the colors of what Angels is doing. It's a 4-mana 3/4 with that ability that we can kick it twice and deal 2 damage based on how many times we kick it. You know, we can either play it just for 4 mana straight up as a 3/4 Angel, depending on what the board state is. So definitely not a bad Angel in the 4-drop slot. We also have Sarah Paragon. Not super effective in this deck in that way. In that idea that we're not playing a lot of early turn Angels, but what makes this card, I think, very good is, you know, besides us having like, you know, we have Fable the Mirror Breaker, so if our Kiki-Jiki dies or this gets somehow destroyed in the process, goes to the graveyard, we could always recast this. We can cast Inspire and Overseer, we can recast a Giada, we can technically recast the Meathook Massacre. So definitely, you know, it still hits some things that could go to our graveyard in case, depending on what the board state is. So overall, I think it still, you know, finds a room as a one-off in the deck just because it can bring us stuff back. And then in the top end of the deck, we kind of go into Sarah Redeemer as an angel that it's a 5-mana 2/4 that whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put 2+1/+1 counters on that creature. So, you know, Inspiring Overseer, Giada, Font of Hope, both those cards will come into the battlefield with additional +1/+1 or 2 additional +1/+1 counters. Same thing with the Fable, the Mirror Breaker Goblin, as well as, I believe, the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. Another cool card with it, another cool aspect of this is that this actually pairs very well with Sanctuary Warden, as the creatures that come in the battlefield with those additional +1/+1 counters are definitely good targets to also minus counters from in order to get her trigger ability, which makes this a very good pairing together, which is definitely pretty sweet. And then depending on if we have Giada out before all that happens, we can actually have a lot of creatures with +1/+1 counters, and that's why I think Sanctuary Warden is a great top-end card for an Angel-style deck like this. We also have Liasa, Forgotten Archangel, as a 5-mana 4/5. Whenever a non-token we control dies, we get to return that to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. If a creature an opponent would control die, they get exiled, which could be super effective depending on, you know, the deck that they are playing. You know, getting any sort of exile effect that the creature doesn't go to the graveyard, that they could get the creature back or gain some sort of advantage from the creature being in the graveyard. It's definitely very good there. And like I said before, Sanctuary Warden's a great card as it's a 6-mana 5/5, enters the battlefield with 2 shield counters on it. Whenever it enters the battlefield and or attacks, we have to remove a counter from a creature or planeswalker control. If we do, we get to draw a card, create a 1/1 green citizen token, which is definitely very good. And like I said, that citizen token that we create is another card that pairs very well with Sarah Redeemer because that 1/1 actually enters the battlefield as a 3/3. And yet again, that 1/1 token now, or the, you know, depending on, you know, the next turn or whenever the Warden attacks, we can now take the counter from that, you know, that little creature that we have, and then continue the effect over and over again, which makes that overall very, very good. And then, you know, even though we are a little bit on the heavy on the top end, we are at 25 lands. Just want to make sure we kind of hit, you know, hopefully hit our top end as we are leaning more so to the 5, 6, and 7, or 4, 5, and 6 drops of the deck. But, you know, we have 2 copies of Aganjo just as additional, you know, ways to maybe disrupt things what our opponents try to do, or just play it as a basic land type. We have 5 copies of Plains, 2 copies of Swamps, 1 Takenuma, 1 Mountain, 1 Sokazan, 3 Caves of the Kelios, our Kolios, just to make sure we kind of play this early, make sure we kind of hit our colors. This is the only dual land in these colors. There's no, you know, pain land that is of the black-red variety and or the white-red variety. So it's definitely, you know, this is the only one of the pain lands that we have available to us. So that's the one downside to playing decks, you know, of a non-card that doesn't have a Triome. It doesn't have a pain land, so we are only limited to the slow lands and other duels that are of the format. So that's the one downside to the deck. But still, it's not a bad, you know, land to have. We have, you know, 3 copies of Shattered Sanctum. We have 3 copies of Haunted Ridge. We have 2 copies of Sacred Peaks. This is the only other dual land that we have access to for this color, so we added 2 of those just to make sure we hit our white and red. And then we also have 2 copies of Sundown Pass. So, you know, it's yet again another very interesting deck. There are Angels that are in the blue-white variety, but I do think the power for Angels currently, and I didn't think that, you know, that the power was, it didn't warrant enough for me to splash blue to play them in Angels. I think this is the better version of the color combinations you could do for Angels, playing the white, black, and red. But overall, I do think Mardu Angels could see some play. I do think there's a lot of cards that if you know, get the right matchup, you do get a good draw, you can kind of keep the board clean to get yourself to that midpoint of the game. This is yet again another good mid-range style deck that does have a lot of value in that mid-range area of the deck. So if you can get there, I do think this deck could, overwhelm your opponent pretty quickly. Now, the last deck up on the list is another deck that, I'm always experimenting. I'm always a big Tempo fan, and I kind of want to experiment, kind of see how a Izzet style Tempo deck would work out, as I did, I think, mention it when we were talking through the previews, and I think I mentioned it a couple times as in other videos of, when I was talking about certain cards of the format. So I kind of put together an Izzet Tempo pile. It's a low, curve pile, like most Tempo decks want to be. They want to be able to play some creatures out, but also leave up protection. We are playing Delver in the deck, because we are a balance of creatures and non-creature spells, and we want to make sure we have creatures out early and make sure then we can leave up that protection spell later. In the one-drop slot, we are playing Combat Research. I think this is a great card. It's a Curiosity, enchantment aura kind of thing that whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card, which is good. And if we enchant it to a legendary creature, which we do play 2 legendary creatures in the deck, or one card that we play 2 copies of, we can put on that creature, give it an additional +1/+1 and ward 1, so it makes it harder for our opponent to remove that. So I do think this is a good card for this deck, just because it only costs 1 mana, which then leaves gives us enough mana to have open just in case that we need to protect maybe a creature that we put it on overall. We are also playing Consider in the deck, just a good way to kind of dig a little bit on the cheap. We can look at top part of our library. If we like it, we can keep it. If we don't like it, we throw it to the graveyard and we still draw a card. Delver of Secrets, just another, one-drop aggressive creature. That's a 1-mana 1/1. If we reveal a non-creature spell or reveal an instant or sorcery at the beginning of our upkeep, we get to flip it to the 3/2. We want to make sure we hit this on 1. Hopefully on turn 2 we flip it, which makes it, that much better. We also play Shore Up as a good protection spell, because I do think you want to play a balance of Shore Up and slip out the back, because Shore Up gives target creature +1/+1 to end a turn, hexproof, and untap it, making it be able to sit back as a blocker. And then hexproof is still very good. Slip out the back, gives it a +1/+1 counter, and phases out until the end of turn, which could be used in being aggressive, or it could be used as a way to be protective, or even if your opponent's overwhelming us, we can kind of get rid of a key creature and kind of open up a lane for us to attack into. We do have 1 Spell Pierce as a kind of like a way, it's not something, it's good to draw in the early game, but we don't want to play multiple copies of it where it becomes useless, and those turns where your opponent's possibly leave a mana open, that would not make this card effective. So we do have a one-off of that in the deck. We have 3 copies of Ancestral Anger, just as a good way to kind of pump our creatures, and also being able to tempo us by helping us draw a card in the process. And we give target creature +X/+0, where X is 1 plus the number of this card in our graveyard. So definitely not bad there. We have 3 copies of Play with Fire. Yet again, a good way to spot removal something, do damage to the face, scry the top card of the library if we do so. Definitely good kind of 1-mana removal spell there. We have 1 copy of Ledger Shredder. This is kind of one of those cards I was playing around with how many copies I wanted to add. I actually felt that when I played more than just 1, it felt clunky when I drew it, just because sometimes it kind of slows down what we're trying to do, because it's really hard, to commit sometimes 2 mana, depending on what the board state is, especially in the early turns when you want to kind of play something on the cheap, but also leave mana open to protect. So Ledger Shredder only is a one-off in the deck. It's definitely something that could could fluctuate around depending on what people are playing when it comes to the meta when it develops. We have 2 copies of Make Disappear, 2-mana counter spell that we can also play Casualty of 1 and give it a copy. But we can just an early turn disruption. This is kind of the stuff we want to do in this style of deck, where we want to kind of counter a spell where our opponent didn't leave up the mana to pay that too. So definitely not bad there. We are playing Storm Chaser Drake as another good card that whenever this becomes target of a spell we control, we get to draw a card. So this is kind of like a good, another good key tempo card that's going to help us out. No matter what we target it with, if we are the ones casting it, we get to draw a card out of it, which is a good benefit. So if we put a Combat Research on it, we're going to draw a card just for putting the Combat Research on it. If we're going to, protect it with a Shore Up or slip out the back, we can pump up a card. Ancestral Anger, same thing. So overall, a very, very good card that's going to give us a lot of tempo if our opponent's not able to get rid of it. Because we are playing a very low curve, Electrostatic Infantry is another card that is a great card for this style of deck, because we are playing that balance of instants and sorceries as well as creatures. And then every time we cast an instant or sorcery, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it's a 2-mana 1/2. So if our opponent doesn't get rid of it early and we're able to kind of ramp up with our spells, this card could get very out of hand very, very quickly. Kami's Flare, because we do play a few cards that will get +1/+1 counters. It's not a bad card, as we can deal damage based to whatever creature. 3 damage to them, and then if we control a modified creature, we can also do 2 damage to the controller. So a decent card to kind of splash in here, because we sometimes do have those modified creatures. We have Lightning Strike, 3 copies of it. Just, deal 3 damage to any target. Just another good way to kind of spot removal something or deal damage to the face, depending on what the board state is. We are playing a couple copies of Twin Inferno, either to give a creature we control double strike, or, in the case that maybe you want to, cast 2 additional copies of Lightning Strike and deal 6 damage, depending on what your attacks are. You can do that as well. Or with any of our other, non-creature spells, we can do any of those. So overall, pretty decent card, depending on what the board state is. We can cast it in multiple ways and kind of help us, figure out, how to navigate through whatever we're trying to get through. We have 2 copies of Balmor. This is the legendary creature that we are playing in the deck. It's a 2-mana 1/3 with flying that whenever we cast an instant sorcery spell, creatures we control get +1/+0 and trampled end of turn. This is kind of that card that's going to help us, hopefully finish off our opponent, because we just play a bunch of cheap spells. This is going to be that card that's going to help us push that last points of damage through on our opponent, as well as pumping the team in the process. So this is kind of like the Magecraft card for a blue-red deck. So this is definitely a card that I do think 2 copies is probably more than enough, but I don't think it warrants 3 to 4 copies, because we're not really trying to cast even 2 copy spells outside of the ones we do have, and I do think the ones that we do have other than this one are much better. So I do think Balmor is good, but I just don't think it's something that you want to, because it's also legendary, you can't have more than 1 out, so it's not a card that you want to have a ton of in your deck as well. Then in the top end of the deck, we have Haughty Jin, a 3-mana star 4, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of instants and sorcery cards in our graveyard. The one upside to this, other than it being the only 3-drop we are playing in the deck, is it makes all our instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast. So basically, any of our instant sorceries in that 2-drop slot now become 1-mana instants and sorceries, which is going to be, very, very good. And it being a star 4, and depending on how many spells we may have played beforehand, it makes either a good blocker, definitely is a very strong attacker as the game goes on and we play more instants and sorceries. So I do think this is a card that, yet again, this deck probably doesn't need 4 of them, because, like I said, we want to keep the deck on the cheap and be able to leave mana open. So overall, 2 of, I think, is a perfect balance for what we're trying to do here. And then in the mana slot, I think we are playing 22 lands. We have 6 islands, 1 Ottawar, 6 mountains. We have 1 Sakuzen. We have 4 copies of Shivian Reef and 4 copies of Stormcarved Coast. So, we are pretty lucky on, having the proper dual lands, I think, in the current meta. And I do think this is definitely a pretty decent list. That's, like I said, it's a tempo deck, so we're trying to play that balance of being aggressive while also being a little bit on the protection, leaving some mana open for counters, leaving some mana open for, protection, then also being able to push damage in through with being able to do damage to the face, be able to pump creatures and things like that, and also be able to, draw cards when we deal combat damage overall. So definitely a pretty interesting list to start out with, and like I said, depending on how the meta develops, we'll kind of see how a deck like this could play out, just because there are cards in the format that definitely, hurt a deck that is very low to the ground, but I do think this is a good place to start out with. And that's going to do it for today's video. I do think, like I said, each of these are like some brews that I kind of came up with the release of Dominaria United. If you guys like any of them, all the links for these will be down in the description below. If you want to copy them into Arena, try them out for yourself, make the tweaks that you think need to be made. Before you even make the deck, you can kind of base it, maybe make a template out of this and kind of make your own tweaks based on how you feel like you need to play with these deck types. Like I said, I do think, because we're early into Dominaria United, there's a lot of experimenting out. We really won't know what the meta is. Even if the meta is saying, like, these 5 decks are really at the top at the time, it's definitely something that could change over time as people kind of get more familiarized with what's the good stuff, what's the bad stuff. And I do think, I'm actually excited, because I do think that Dominaria United did enough to the format that could shake up a lot of things of how the meta is going to go. So definitely pretty excited for that. But like I said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely lets me know you like these style of videos. If you're new here, you want to know I post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.